Hi, I'm Sean Wildermuth. Welcome back to Coding Shorts. I've been digging into AutoMapper and some of its competitors for an upcoming coding short. While doing that, I realized I needed a way to build a lot of test data to really be able to dig in to how well AutoMapper and its competitors do on mapping one object to the other. And I ran into a great library called Bogus, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get started, I did want to mention I have a class coming up in Atlanta at the end of March. If you go to sean.wildermuth.com, you'll be able to get more information about that. Let's get started. So like a lot of the coding shorts, the example here is going to be on my GitHub. That's github.com/seanwildermuth/coding shorts. I'll leave a description down in the notes for this video in case you just want to go directly there. But I'm starting out with a pretty simple project I have. And it has a number of entities that should be familiar to you: customers, orders, order items, and addresses. And in fact, I am using them in a context here for saving them to a data store. None of that really matters. I'm not going to dive into how that works, because what I really want to do is have a way to build a bunch of test data. And so the easiest way really is to use something I found called Bogus, and we're going to dig into that. Now, to get started, I'm just going to show you the project running, just so you can see where we're getting started. This is just a simple website to show some customer data. Nothing really dramatic about it. There's a little CSS to make it look better, but this should be showing us something from the data store that has those customers, but we have not created any of those customers yet. So the first thing I want to do is down here in services, I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call it fakers.cs. I'm just going to create a public class here called fakers. This is just going to be a simple class that I'm going to register in the service container. So builder.services. Because this is stateless, I'm just going to create a singleton of our faker. Bring that namespace in, fakers, right? And we'll use this fakers in a little bit, but we have to make this actually do something. And here I'm going to return something called a faker. But of course, I don't have this idea of a faker because I don't have a project set up in here, right? It's going to let me pull in the entities, but for faker, it doesn't know what it is. And that's because we need to add the dependency. So let me go ahead and manage. And I'm just going to put in here for the search, Bogus. And here at the top, Bogus, bunch of downloads. With that many downloads, you'd think I would have run into this before, but nope. Now it's installed. We can get rid of that. We can go back and bring in that namespace for the faker using Bogus, right? And the idea here is we want to create a generator, and that's what this idea of a faker is, that can create one or more customers. And so we're just going to say get customer generator. Now this custom generator is going to actually return one that we've already pre-built. Now I'm doing this so that if we call it multiple times, we're not generating all this code again. I'm just going to call this the customer faker, and I'll just leave it at null. Stop that background process, and I'll leave it at null. And all I'll do is say if customer faker is null, then we need to build it. Otherwise, just return customer faker, right? None of this should be brilliant with what you're talking about. So the first thing we want to do is actually assign the customer faker to a new faker for customer, right? All that should seem pretty simple. And this exposes a fluent syntax. This fluent syntax is going to allow us to say, create rules for individual fields, right? And so I'll say here, customer, and I'm going to set up the company name. Then I'll have another lambda that does something. What can it do? I can go ahead and Bogus has a number of these different categories of type of information you might need: person, phone, random, unique index, vehicle. And in my case, I'm going to actually go to the company group and I'm going to say, give me a company name. And so I'm telling it when we create fake ones here, it's going to attempt to create a bunch of company names from a random set of heuristics that are inside of Bogus. Now you can create rules that might not need one of those fakers. We may want to do something like for the ID, let's go ahead and do what? We want to generate that ID. Let's go ahead and create a customer, an ID equal to 0. And here we'll just say plus ID. So every time that this is called, it will increment the ID, so the first one will be 1, and create a fake ID for us. And so what you're doing in this piece of the code is really up to you, though it has a lot of these heuristics that we're going to really want to use. So let me copy a couple more of these. And so here I'm going to say contact name, right? And here we're going to say, we're going to go to name and use it as full name here. Now name has a number of different heuristics you can use here, first name, last name, etc. So you can really build this up into be exactly what you want. And for our third one here, I'm just going to say phone. And unsurprisingly, we can just say phone dot, and there's a phone number format, there's a phone or a locale for a phone, but I'm going to use phone number format. And one of the things I want is that not every one of these customers, and you'll notice that phone is a string question mark, so it's nullable. I don't want everyone to have a phone number. So I can actually then say, or null. Here I'm going to pass in the faker, and then I'm going to give it a number for how much representation there should be. So if I put 05F, I'm going to say that half of the companies aren't going to have phone numbers, but I actually want it to be much smaller. So I'm going to say 0.15. We have other properties here that we'll get into, especially we have an address here and a collection of orders, but we're going to get to that eventually. So make sure and add that extra one. And now we're set. We have this faker, right? So how do we actually use this? Remember, I put it into dependency. So let's go to our page where we weren't seeing any customers. And I'd been pulling them from the database. But first, let's see if the faker works. So if I go ahead and say fakers, let's go ahead and add a member that it assigns to, and then we can use that here by just saying fakers.get customer generator. So it's going to execute and get that object. And then we're going to say generate, and I'm going to do something like 50. And this will return a collection that here we're just assigning here of enumerable. Now there could be other rule sets, there could be other things you can do, but at its base, we're just going to generate them. So let's see what it looks like in the browser. And what you can see here is it's generated these names. Here's the name of the company, here's the name of that contact, and here's the telephone number. And we can see that a number of them are missing their telephone numbers, right? No telephone, no telephone. And if we counted them, it would probably be 7 or 8 based on the expectation. But most of them have phone numbers. And that's the interesting part of this. We can set up these rules to generate these fake data that we can use with and know that we're not going to accidentally be using real people. So when we're seeing all of this different data, right, every time we refresh, we're going to get a new sample data, and that might not be exactly what we want, right? We don't want it to generate it forever. And one way we can do this is to add in our faker and tell it to use a seed value. So use seed, and here I'm going to give it a number, and this number is going to help the faker generate the same data every time it's used. So I'm just going to put some number in there. It doesn't matter as long as you're using the same one every time. If we run it again, we can see that it's all the same data. Wait, no it isn't. So what happened? When we look back at our project, we are telling it to use the seed, but of course, because we said this was a singleton, every time we refresh the page, the singleton is being reused, so it's generating the next 50 and the next 50 and the next 50. So the trick here is, so let's make this transient instead. So each time we get a new fakers object, which may imply some small amount of overhead, But when we need it to be the same data over and over so we can write tests against it and those sorts of things, we're really telling it to generate the same data every time. So now as we refresh, those first 50 are always going to be the same here. And in fact, if I come back over here and let's say 75, right, before I press save, remember that the last one here was Bayer Lutgen, right, with a Hulda. Just remember that for a minute. So I'm going to save it, and it's going to try to do it. And of course, we now have all 75 because it did that little code injection, but this 50th guy is still the same. So we can see that seed is allowing us to make sure we're building the same temp data over and over again, right? But in our customers, let's go back here into the fakers. In our customers, we may want to actually handle more rules here. And so one of the ideas is to say, I want to have a rule for address. Now, address is its own object. And so how do we actually generate an address here? That's a little confusing, right? I'm going to leave that alone. Let's stop our project. And I'm going to create a new piece here. I'm going to create a faker for address. I'll call this the address faker. And then I'm just going to do a little copy and paste to create another method. It's called editor inheritance. It's not against any rules. Don't tell anybody I ever did this. It's our little secret. And we'll just have an address generator here, and let's just make sure that we rename this to address faker in all places. But of course our rules are going to need to be different because we're faking an address now. I'm going to keep that same seed. It could be a different number because this is a different faker, but I like it there to be consistency with that number each time. And so we're going to do the same thing we did before and increment the address number here. And because it's inside here, I don't have to name them different. It's literally just going to create a closure to this lambda that we're going to use to generate it, right? Because this just gets executed every time. So let's start with address 1. We can get rid of these. And unsurprising, there's an address. And I'm going to say the first line is going to be a street address, right? And I'm just going to quickly do city, state, province, postal code. And unsurprisingly, these have the same thing. It has a city it can generate, has a state, and a zip code. Now, I don't know how you're going to generate it for other regions, evidently because zip code is very much in the US, but it's a start. And so that would all work, but we really want to have also address 2 here, right? And address 2 is going to be secondary address. This is usually the suite of the apartment number. But this would generate it for all of them. So what are we going to do? We're going to use or null again. Pass in that faker object that's being passed in the lambda. And then here I'm going to say about half of them are going to have suite numbers or room numbers or floor numbers, those sorts of things. So we have our faker here. Oh, I forgot to change this. Almost like watching me run this code bare. And so we now can create fake addresses. So what are we going to do? We're actually going to come up here and address faker. We're going to get our own copy of this, just like we would in other ways. Get that generator, and then we can use it here to generate our addresses. So I'm going to say address faker, generate 1. Now, the way that generate works is it always generates a collection, in fact, a list. So I'm going to have to say first here, So go ahead and generate an address, and the first one spit in here. And I'm also going to say or null. Even though we've called the link first here, we can still do this because it ends up being a extension method. So on our first object, I'm just going to say pass that f in again, and I'm going to say an address is null about 10% of the time. So now that we have this, every time we generate a customer, we're also going to generate an address as well. And so let's run this again. And you'll notice it had been empty here when we had addresses because none of them had valid addresses. And you can see some of them don't have addresses and some of them do. And we're able to generate all this data, again, still using that same key, so we're getting the same addresses and phone numbers and names every time. So this really creates a way for you to create this dummy data. But for us, this was just the first step, right? What we really want to do is we want to go ahead and seed the database with this dummy data. So here in the index, let's go back to using the context, and let's go to our context object. And here I might go model builder entity customer has data, right? Have a way for us to actually add data that's going to be in there. And so the first thing we need to do is get our faker, right? We need fakers, and let's bring in the assignment of our faker object. And then we should be able to just say get customer generator, generate 50. And so if we're going to use this, we can go ahead and just open up a console here. I'm just going to say .NET EF migrations add with data. We don't have migrations yet, so it's going to add the information to build the database as well as our dummy data. Uh-oh, seed entry customer cannot be added because a no value is added for address ID. That's interesting, right? Well, if we go back and look at our entities, our customer has an address, and that's how we were creating it, but we also needed an address ID so that the database knew how to actually store it. And so we're going to change our faker for just a minute. I'm going to say bool include addresses, right? And I'm going to assign this to true so that all our existing code works. But what I really want to be able to do is say, let's end this one here. And I'll just say if include addresses, I'll just go ahead and say customer faker equals customer faker with this rule. And I think I'm missing a semicolon. Yep. And so this way, we can allow ourselves to create it or not create it. And then that means back in our context, we'll be able to do this in a little different way. Now, the way that hasData works is it wants to have you include the ID and then use those IDs to assign them to the related entity. You can't just add the address object in and it be okay with that. And so in our case, we're just going to say addresses, and we're going to go ahead and generate, get address generator, and then we're going to generate 50. And in this case, we're going to include an address for each one of them. You could write some more elaborate code to do this. And then we're going to use the model builder and go ahead and add our addresses has data addresses. And this works because addresses are just their own atomic object, right? And now we're going to want to do the same thing for these. For our customers equals, let's go ahead and generate those 50, but we also need to assign the address ID. And so I'll do it a little brute force. I'll use a for x is less than customers.count. And let's go ahead and increment that. And I'm just going to do that so I can then say customers x dot address I wanted to say address ID, right? And I'm going to get that. But in fact, we used the wrong generator here. So get customer generator. And we're going to assign it by just using the addresses.id, right? I'm just going to assign one of the 50 there, and then I can say customers. And I forgot to initialize the X. Make sense? Now that we have that, can we go ahead and open up and create our migrations again? And when we get to generator, we have to make sure and we send false, so it's not going to create those addresses. Otherwise, it's just not going to know what to do with itself. So we'll build it, and let's go ahead and add that migration again. And now we can see our migrations, as we can actually see all of this test data, right? It has generated the addresses and the customers for us. And so if we go back into our page, and so here, let's go ahead and add the migration, or apply the migration more importantly. So I'm going to say database drop, because I've had this database from an old version. Yes, of course we want to. And then we'll update it to assign our migrations to it. And now if we run it, now that that used data should be applied, you can see we're getting all that same data, right? It's just like we had it before. We're ordering it in a different order, but we're getting it from the database, and we know that because it's in company name order, and we're all set. Hopefully you've learned something and have a new tool to use. Of course, you could be telling me in the comments, everyone's known about Bogus for years and years, and Bogus.js should be being used in Node for years and years. And that might be true, but hopefully some people were as behind the times as I was and just noticed Bogus. Thanks for joining me. If you've gotten this far, please like and subscribe. That always helps me. I'm also doing a course on building ASP.NET with Vue at the end of the month. Here's a little tag to show you what that course is all about, and you can sign up today to be notified when registration's open. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.